A municipal courtroom is a crucible, burning away patience and dignity until only raw nerve is left. On a humid Tuesday, officers Frank Miller and Tom Kincaid, men who wore their badges like crowns, sat in the gallery, snickering. The man they were there to testify against, Marcus Thorne, sat at the defendant's table in a cheap, ill-fitting suit. He was a nobody, another black man who'd resisted their authority. They whispered jokes, mocking his quiet demeanor, unaware that the man they were trying to jail for disorderly conduct wasn't just another case. He was the man running the entire Federal Bureau of Investigation. The municipal courthouse of the 17th District was not a place of grandeur. It was a factory of consequences, smelling of stale coffee, industrial floor wax, and the faint metallic tang of human desperation. The air, thick and unmoving, hummed with the drone of fluorescent lights. In courtroom 3B, Judge Cynthia Wallace, a woman whose face had been carved by 2 decades of witnessing the worst of human nature, presided over the morning's docket with weary efficiency. Case 739B, People v. Thorne, the clerk announced in a monotone. At the defendant's table, Marcus Thorne stood. He was a man of medium height, early 50s, with a face that seemed thoughtful and reserved. He wore a charcoal grey suit that was just a size too large in the shoulders, a detail not missed by the 2 men in the gallery. His public defender, Sarah Jenkins, a young woman barely 5 years out of law school, looked overwhelmed, her arms clutching a stack of files as if for protection. In the first row of the gallery sat Officer Frank Miller and Officer Tom Kincaid. Miller was a bull of a man, his police uniform straining at the neck. Kincaid was leaner, with a fox-like smile that rarely left his face. They were veterans, which in this precinct meant they were untouchable. "Look at this clown," Miller whispered to Kincaid, nudging him with an elbow. His voice was a low growl, but it carried in the quiet room. "Gets himself a public defender, thinks he's a big shot." Kincaid snickered, covering his mouth. "Probably stole that suit. Look at him all stone-faced. He's shaking, I bet. Thinks he's better than us." Marcus Thorne heard them. He had been trained to hear everything, the click of a safety, the lie in a voice, the whisper of conspiracy. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped on the table. His stillness was not fear. It was control. It was the patience of a predator or a savior, depending on which side of his justice you were on. He had been in this city for 6 weeks, operating out of a nondescript field office, running the most significant domestic corruption investigation of his career. Operation Kingfisher was his baby, aimed at a ring of police officers who were not just taking kickbacks, but actively facilitating the movement of narcotics for a major cartel. The 17th Precinct was the cancer's heart. 3 nights ago, he had been on foot, conducting solo surveillance of a warehouse on 4th and Elm, a known drop point. He was dressed in civilian clothes, observing. That was when Miller and Kincaid's cruiser had rolled up. They hadn't been on patrol, they had been visiting. They were there to pick up their cut. They had seen him. A black man, standing alone, watching. It was a deviation from their plan, and they couldn't have it. They had confronted him. He had remained calm. "I'm just standing here, officers." "This here is our here," Miller had sneered. "We don't like people just standing." When he had refused to be intimidated, they had manufactured a reason. They claimed he was agitated and menacing. When he calmly asked for their badge numbers, they had arrested him. The charges: disorderly conduct and interference with a police investigation. It was a nightmare for his security detail, but for Marcus it was an opportunity. He had waived his right to a phone call from the precinct, letting the system process him. He wanted to see it from the inside. He wanted to see the rot from the roots. And now he was seeing it, sitting in the front row, laughing at him. "All right, Mr. Heston," Judge Wallace said to the Assistant District Attorney. "Your opening?" Ada Heston, a man with a thin moustache and thinner ambitions, stood. "Your Honor, this is a simple, open and shut case. The people will show that the defendant, Marcus Thorne, willfully and maliciously interfered with Officers Miller and Kincaid in the performance of their duties. He was aggressive, non-compliant, and a threat to public order. We will hear from these two decorated officers, and we will ask the court to find Mr. Thorne guilty." Sarah Jenkins rose, her voice trembling slightly. "Your Honor, the defense will show that Mr. Thorne was a citizen, committing no crime, standing on a public street when he was harassed, intimidated, and then falsely arrested by these officers. This isn't a case about justice, it's about an abuse of power." Miller laughed audibly. "Abuse of power? That's a new one." Judge Wallace's gavel cracked. "Officer Miller, if you cannot maintain the decorum of this court, you will be waiting in the hall." "Sorry, Your Honor, just passionate about justice," Miller said, his eyes locking with Marcus's. Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. He held it until Miller, unnerved by the lack of fear, looked away first. "Mr. Heston," the judge said, "call your first witness." "The people call Officer Frank Miller." Miller stood, swaggering as he walked to the stand. He passed the defendant's table and leaned in close to Marcus. "Your day's about to get a whole lot worse, boy," he whispered, so only Marcus and Sarah could hear. Sarah Jenkins flinched. Marcus Thorne simply watched him pass, his calm unbroken. He had dealt with men like Frank Miller his entire life. They were loud, they were bullies, and they were, without exception, sloppy. And slop was something Marcus Thorne was very, very good at cleaning up. The witness stand was Frank Miller's stage. He settled into the chair, adjusting his duty belt, a practiced move designed to remind everyone in the room of his authority. He was sworn in, and Ada Heston began. "Officer Miller, could you please recount the events of the evening of November 3rd? "Yes, sir," Miller said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "My partner, Officer Kincaid, and I were patrolling a high-crime area. We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity near the warehouse on 4th and Elm. It's a known drug trafficking corridor." In the gallery, Kincaid nodded in solemn agreement, playing his part perfectly. "And what did you observe upon arrival?" Heston asked, pacing. "We observed the defendant, Mr. Thorne," Miller said, pointing a thick finger at Marcus. "He was lurking in the shadows, very suspicious. When we illuminated him with our spotlight, he didn't move. He just stared, like he owned the place." "What happened when you approached him?" "I asked him what he was doing. He got lippy, said we had no right to talk to him. I told him it was a high-crime area, and we were just doing our jobs. He got agitated." "Agitated? How so?" Heston prompted. "He squared up," Miller lied, his voice rising with indignation. He clenched his fists, started breathing heavy, telling me I wasn't a real cop, that I was just a pig. In my 20 years on the force, I've learned to read the signs. He was going to get violent. In the front row, Sarah Jenkins was scribbling furiously, a red flush climbing her neck. "That's a lie," she whispered to Marcus. Marcus simply placed a hand on her arm, a silent, "Wait." "And what did you do, officer?" "I did what I was trained to do," Miller said, a picture of heroic restraint. "I tried to de-escalate. I told him to calm down, show me some ID. He refused. He said, and I quote, 'You'll have to kill me first.' He was causing a scene, yelling, trying to attract a crowd. This was a particularly creative flourish. The street had been deserted, a fact Marcus had personally ensured before his surveillance. He was becoming a danger to himself and to us, Miller continued. So when he took a swing at me— Objection, Sarah Jenkins shot to her feet. There is not one word in the police report, Officer Miller's own report, about the defendant taking a swing. Judge Wallace looked at Heston. Mr. Heston. Heston looked flustered, glancing at Miller. Miller hadn't prepped him on this part. Officer, perhaps you could clarify. Miller waved it off. It wasn't a full swing, more of a lunge, a menacing gesture. I felt my life was in danger. We had no choice but to effect an arrest. He resisted, of course. We had to physically restrain him. And the charge of interference? While we were trying to secure him, he was yelling, "I know your names. I know where you live." He was trying to intimidate us, to stop us from investigating the warehouse. Clearly, he was a lookout. Heston smiled, his work done. Thank you, officer. No further questions. He sat down, looking immensely proud. In the gallery, Kincaid was practically vibrating with silent laughter. He and Miller were in top form. They had this. The case would be closed by noon, they'd get a commendation from the ADA, and they'd be back at the warehouse by nightfall for their real business. Judge Wallace looked at the public defender. Miss Jenkins, you're cross? Sarah took a deep breath. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a single, slow nod. You have this. Stick to the facts. She approached the stand, her heels clicking nervously. Officer Miller, thank you for your vivid testimony. You mentioned you were in a high-crime area. Can you define that? It's, an area with high crime. Miller smirked. Kincaid laughed. I see. And you received an anonymous tip. Was this tip logged, per protocol? It was a street source, a CI. We don't log those for their protection. So, there is no record, no 911 call, no dispatcher log, no CI file. Just your word. My word's been good enough for 20 years, Miller bristled. I'm sure, Sarah said, her confidence growing. You testified that my client squared up and clenched his fists. Is that correct? That's right. And that he lunged at you? Yes. Then why, Officer Miller, is there no mention of any of that in your sworn police report? The report you filed an hour after the arrest? Miller's smirk tightened. Reports are summaries. We can't put every little detail in. A physical assault seems like a big detail, wouldn't you say? Your report, and I have it here, marked as Defense Exhibit A, states, and I quote, subject was non-compliant and verbally abusive, requiring physical restraint. There is no mention of a lunge, a swing, or any physical threat from Mr. Thorne. Only to him. Heston stood up. Objection. Counsel is characterizing. Counsel is reading, Judge Wallace said, her eyes fixed on Miller. Overruled. Answer the question, officer. Miller's face was turning a blotchy red. Like I said, it's a summary. I'm clarifying now. So you're clarifying, under oath, that your original sworn report was incomplete, or inaccurate. I'm saying, Miller spat, that he was a danger, and I stand by my testimony. You also said he was a lookout for the warehouse. Did you investigate the warehouse after arresting Mr. Thorne? That investigation is ongoing. So you left. You arrested the supposed lookout, and then just left the scene of the crime you were supposedly investigating. You didn't secure the warehouse. You didn't call for backup to sweep it. The color drained from Miller's face. He had stepped right into it. He couldn't have investigated the warehouse because he and Kincaid were part of the operation running out of it. We made a tactical decision, Miller stammered. "The scene was compromised." "Or," Sarah countered, "there was no investigation. There was no anonymous tip. There was only my client, standing on a sidewalk, and you, Officer Miller, who decided to arrest him for, as the kids say, contempt of cop. Isn't that the truth?" Miller slammed his hand on the railing of the stand. "I'm a decorated officer. I won't be slandered by some ambulance chaser and her thug client." "Officer," Judge Wallace's voice was ice, "that is your one warning. Control yourself, or I will hold you in contempt." "Ms. Jenkins, do you have any further questions?" Sarah smiled, a small, tight smile. "No, Your Honor. The officer has been abundantly clear." As Miller stomped off the stand and returned to the gallery, Kincaid put a hand on his shoulder. "Easy, Frank. She's nobody. We got this." But their laughter was gone. The mockery had been replaced by a low, simmering rage. They had been embarrassed, and they would make someone pay. Their eyes fell on Marcus Thorne, the man who sat, as he had from the beginning, in perfect, infuriating calm. "Court will recess for 30 minutes, Judge Wallace announced, looking exhausted. The moment the gavel fell, the room erupted in a low roar of shuffling feet and murmured conversations. Sarah Jenkins slumped into a chair, the adrenaline draining from her, leaving a trembling void. That was good, right?" she whispered to Marcus, not truly believing it. "I think I got him." "You did very well, Sarah," Marcus said. His voice was warm, and it calmed her more than she would have expected. "You established the inconsistencies. You boxed him in on the warehouse." "It's still his word against yours," she fretted, organizing her papers. "And he's a cop. Heston will call Kincaid next. Kincaid will back up Miller's story, probably the new, lunging version, and it's over." Marcus looked at her. "What do you want to do? We can offer a plea, a fine, time served." Sarah was stunned. "What? No, we're not pleading. You're innocent. We're fighting this." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Marcus's lips. "I know. I just needed to be sure you were." "Of course I am," she said, insulted. "Why would you—" "Oh." She stopped, realizing he wasn't just a client. He was assessing her. In the gallery, Miller and Kincaid were fuming. "That little bitch," Miller spat, standing in the aisle. "She tried to make me look like a fool." "Calm down, Frank," Kincaid said, his eyes darting around. "You're drawing attention." "I don't care. And him," Miller pointed at the defense table. "Sitting there like he's the King of England. I'm going to wipe that smug look off his face." Ada Heston hurried over, dabbing his moustache with a handkerchief. "Frank, Tom, we need to talk. That lunge thing. You didn't tell me about that. You can't change the story on the stand. It makes us look bad." "Relax, Heston," Miller said, clapping the smaller man on the shoulder, hard enough to make him wince. "It's fine. Kincaid's up next. He'll confirm it all. He'll add details. The judge will believe 2 decorated cops over him." Just stick to the script," Heston pleaded. "The original script." Yeah, Miller said, dismissive. The attorneys and the judge filed out, leaving the courtroom mostly empty, save for the defendants, their families, and the 2 officers, who were now deliberately blocking the main aisle. Marcus stood, buttoning his ill-fitting jacket. "Let's get some air, Ms. Jenkins." He and Sarah made their way to the aisle. Miller and Kincaid didn't move. They stood side by side, a wall of blue-clad arrogance. "Excuse me," Sarah said, trying to edge past. Kincaid looked down at her. "Well, if it isn't the legal dream team, you really put on a show in there, sweetheart. Very passionate." "Please let us by," Sarah said, her voice rising. Miller turned his attention to Marcus. He was a good 4 inches taller and outweighed him by 100 pounds. He stepped directly into Marcus's path. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Miller's voice was low and menacing. "You think you and your little public school lawyer are going to win? Let me tell you how this ends. You get found guilty, you get 60 days, and you learn real fast what happens to people who disrespect the law." Marcus looked up at him. His face was a mask of placid neutrality. He said nothing. "What, cat got your tongue?" Miller taunted. "Not so tough without your script, are you? You think you're special? You're just another piece of trash we had to sweep up." He brought his face closer, his own smelling of stale coffee and wintergreen. "You're nobody." And then Miller did something that crossed a line, even for him. He shoved Marcus. Not hard, but a sharp, two-handed push to the chest. "Watch where you're going, boy." Marcus staggered back a step, his foot catching on the leg of a bench. He didn't fall, but he was forced to steady himself. "Hey!" Sarah yelled, pulling out her phone. "That's assault. You're assaulting my client, in a courthouse." The bailiff at the front of the room, who had been conveniently looking at his shoes, finally glanced up. Kincaid grabbed Miller's arm. "Frank, you idiot! Not here! There are cameras!" Miller looked around, his rage giving way to a flicker of panic. He hadn't thought of that. He smoothed his uniform, his face setting into a self-righteous scowl. He was threatening me," Miller said, loud enough for the bailiff to hear. "He was getting in my face. I was defending myself." "He didn't say a word," Sarah was furious. "He just stood there. I'm reporting this. Bailiff, did you see that?" The bailiff sighed, walking over. "Ma'am, I just saw a discussion. Let's everybody just go to their separate corners. Recess is almost over." "A discussion?" Sarah was apoplectic. "He shoved him." "Miss Jenkins," Marcus said, his voice as calm and steady as a river. He straightened his cheap jacket and tie. He looked at Miller, not with anger, but with something else. Pity? Disappointment? "It's fine." "Fine?" "It's fine," Marcus repeated, and the authority in those two words silenced her. He looked at the bailiff. "Thank you for your assistance, officer." He then looked at Miller and Kincaid. The mask was gone. For 1 second, Sarah Jenkins saw the man underneath. The man who wasn't all calm, all patience. What she saw was a cold, focused rage that was more terrifying than all of Miller's bluster. It was the look of a man who had just finalized a decision. "Let's go, Sarah," he said, gesturing for her to walk ahead of him. As they walked away, Kincaid let out a nervous laugh. What a psycho, just stares. Miller rubbed his hands, which were still tingling from the shove. Whatever. He's done. When Kincaid gets on the stand, we're burying him. We're burying them both. But as he watched Marcus Thorne walk out of the courtroom, a small, cold seed of doubt began to sprout in his gut. The man didn't act like any nobody he'd ever arrested. He didn't act scared. He didn't act tough. He acted in control. It was a feeling Miller wasn't used to, and he didn't like it one bit. When court resumed, the atmosphere was charged. Sarah Jenkins was vibrating with a new, righteous anger. Ada Heston, sensing the shift, looked pale. Miller and Kincaid were back in the gallery, whispering with renewed intensity. "Mr. Heston, your next witness," Judge Wallace said. "The people call Officer Tom Kincaid." Kincaid strode to the stand, a stark contrast to Miller. He was all smiles and practiced ease. He looked at the judge, at the jury box, though there was none, at Heston. He was the good cop to Miller's bad cop, and it was a role he played well. His testimony was a polished echo of Miller's. Yes, the anonymous tip. Yes, the suspicious individual. Yes, the agitation. and Officer Miller mentioned. "A lunge?" Heston asked, his voice hesitant, clearly hoping Kincaid would downplay it. "Oh, absolutely," Kincaid said, his face hardening into a mask of professional concern. It was terrifying. One moment, Frank, Officer Miller is just talking to the guy, trying to calm him down, and the next, this man, Mr. Thorne, he just explodes. He yells, "I'm not going back!" And he lunges right for Frank's service weapon. "Objection!" Sarah shouted, on her feet. "He's making this up. This is the first time anyone has mentioned a service weapon. It's not in either of their reports." Judge Wallace looked at Kincaid. Her expression was granite. "Officer Kincaid, is that your testimony? That the defendant lunged for your partner's weapon?" "Yes, Your Honor. That's when we had to, subdue him. For officer safety." "And why?" Judge Wallace said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Was this not the very first sentence in your report? An assault on a police officer, an attempt to grab a firearm, that's attempted murder of a police officer, is it not? And you charged him with disorderly conduct?" Kincaid's smile faltered. He hadn't thought of that. We were trying to give him a break, Your Honor. He seemed unwell. We didn't want to ruin his life." "How very compassionate of you," the judge said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Heston, seeing his case implode, scrambled. "No further questions, Your Honor." "Ms. Jenkins." Sarah stood. "Officer Kincaid, you're aware that in the hallway, just 30 minutes ago, your partner, Officer Miller, assaulted Mr. Thorne again." "Objection," Heston yelled. "What happens in the hall is not. It speaks to a pattern of behavior and bias," Sarah shot back. "Sustained," Judge Wallace said, but she looked intrigued. "Move on, Ms. Jenkins." "Fine," Sarah said. "Officer Kincaid, you just testified you didn't investigate the warehouse because you didn't want to ruin Mr. Thorne's life. But Officer Miller testified you didn't investigate because the scene was compromised. Which lie is it?" "Objection." "Sustained." Rephrase, Ms. Jenkins. "Why did your stories about the warehouse change, officer?" They didn't change," Kincaid stammered, his cool evaporating. "Both are true. We were being compassionate and tactical." "You're a liar," Sarah said, not as a question, but a statement. "Objection. Judge, I'm done with this witness. He's perjuring himself." "Ms. Jenkins, that is for me to decide," Judge Wallace snapped. "Are you finished or not?" "Yes, I'm finished." Sarah sat down. "The defense calls Marcus Thorne." A ripple of surprise went through the room. A defendant testifying was rare. A black defendant in a cop versus me case testifying was almost unheard of. It never worked. Marcus stood. He unbuttoned his jacket. He walked to the stand with a calm, measured pace. He was sworn in. Sarah approached him. "Mr. Thorne, please tell the court, in your own words, what happened on the night of November 3rd. And Marcus spoke. His voice was not the voice the courtroom expected. It was not the street vernacular Miller and Kincaid had mimicked. It was deep, articulate, and precise, with a slight, unplaceable accent that spoke of expensive education and total command of the language. "I was conducting surveillance," Marcus began. "Surveillance?" Sarah asked. "What do you mean?" "I am a consultant for a private risk assessment firm. We were hired by an insurance underwriter to observe the warehouse at 4th and Elm, as they had received credible information that the property was being used for non-insured, high-risk activities, which would void their policy. It was a brilliant, ironclad cover. It was, in essence, the truth. I had been on site for approximately 2 hours, logging comings and goings, Marcus continued. At 10:17 p.m., a police cruiser, number 7014, arrived. Officers Miller and Kincaid exited their vehicle. They did not patrol. They did not investigate. They went to a side door of the warehouse, entered a code, and were admitted inside. In the gallery, Frank Miller shot to his feet. "That's a lie! He's lying!" "Order!" Judge Wallace roared, banging her gavel. "Officer Miller, one more outburst and I am having you arrested. Sit down." Miller sat, his face purple. Kincaid was pale as a ghost, staring at Marcus. Marcus continued, unfazed. They remained inside for exactly 22 minutes. They exited at 10:39 p.m. Officer Kincaid was carrying a black duffel bag that he did not have when he entered. They then saw me. They approached, and Officer Miller accused me of spying on them. I informed them I was on a public sidewalk. They demanded ID. I asked for their badge numbers first. They refused. They then grabbed me, twisted my arms behind my back, and arrested me. "And did you, at any point, lunge for Officer Miller's weapon?" Marcus almost smiled. "No, Miss Jenkins, I did not." "Did you clench your fists? Did you square up?" "No, I am trained in de-escalation. I remained as calm as possible." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. No further questions." It was Heston's turn. He looked like a man who had been sent to disarm a bomb with a butter knife, but he had to try. "A consultant," Heston sneered, trying to recover. "What a convenient profession. You just happened to be watching the one warehouse that these two decorated officers were visiting." "There are no coincidences in my line of work, Mr. Heston." "So you were spying on them. You admit it." "I was observing a property," Marcus corrected. "The officer's presence was incidental to my primary observation." "Incidental? You just accused two police officers of taking a bag. You know that's a serious allegation." "I am aware," Marcus said. "I am simply stating what I observed." Heston was losing, and he knew it. He decided to go for a low blow, an attack on character. "Mr. Thorne, you're dressed very simply. This consultant job, it doesn't pay well. You're in a municipal courtroom, represented by a public defender. It doesn't exactly scream high-powered risk consultant." Sarah stood. "Objection. Counsel is mocking the defendant's financial situation. It's prejudicial and irrelevant." "I'll allow it," Judge Wallace said, her eyes on Marcus. "It goes to credibility. Answer the question, Mr. Thorne." Marcus looked at Heston. He smoothed the lapel of his cheap suit. "I believe," Marcus said, his voice quiet, "that a man should be judged by his actions, not by his tailor." "Is that a no?" Heston pressed, sensing weakness. "You're just some rent-a-cop, aren't you? You saw the police, you got scared, and you made up this whole story to save your own skin." "I am not a security guard," Marcus said. "Then what are you?" Heston yelled, his frustration boiling over. "What are you, really? Are you a concerned citizen? A private eye? Or are you just what Officers Miller and Kincaid said you were? A common criminal, a lookout for a drug deal, who's now lying under oath to avoid a conviction?" Heston was red-faced, panting, standing in the middle of the room. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the answer. Marcus looked at Sarah. He looked at the judge. He looked at Miller and Kincaid, who were now smiling, believing Heston had finally cornered him. "What I am, Mr. Heston," Marcus began, "is a man who believes in the rule of—" Bang! The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom flew open, hitting the walls with a sound like a gunshot. Every head snapped to the entrance. Two men stood there. They were not cops. They were not lawyers. They were in immaculate, dark blue suits. They wore earpieces. Their faces were devoid of all emotion. They were, in a word, terrifying. "This court is in session," The bailiff yelled, his hand on his weapon. "You can't!" The first man, older with greying temples, simply flashed a small, laminated ID. The bailiff, who had been so dismissive of Sarah Jenkins, froze. He didn't just look at the ID, he recoiled from it. The two men strode down the central aisle, their polished shoes making no sound on the linoleum. They ignored Heston. They ignored Miller and Kincaid. They walked directly to the bar, opened the swinging gate, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," the older man said, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. "We need to speak with you. It is a matter of national security." Heston was sputtering. "Objection! Your Honor, this is my cross-examination. This is theatre." Judge Wallace, for the first time that day, looked shaken. She had been on this bench for 20 years. She had seen murderers, gang leaders, and corrupt politicians. She had never seen these men. "In my chambers," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Everyone. In my chambers. Now." Judge Wallace's chambers were cramped, filled with legal books and stacks of files. The air, which had been tense in the courtroom, was now suffocating. Present were Judge Wallace, ADA Heston, and Sarah Jenkins. The two men in suits, who had identified themselves as Agent Price and Agent Cho, stood by the door. And at Sarah's insistence, Marcus Thorne was there. "You can't bring the defendant in here," Heston had protested. "He is my client," Sarah had said, her voice iron. "And after what happened in the hall, I'm not letting him out of my sight. He's here as my paralegal." Agent Price had simply nodded. "He stays." Judge Wallace sat behind her desk, her hands folded. "Agent Price, this is highly irregular. You have interrupted a trial. You have, well, what is this? What national security interest could possibly be at play in a disorderly conduct case?" Agent Price, the older of the two, placed a single, sealed manila envelope on her desk. It was marked with a string of intimidating acronyms. "Your Honor," Price said, "we are here on behalf of the Department of Justice." "I see that," Wallace said, not looking at the folder. "What does the DOJ want with Mr. Thorne?" Price and Cho exchanged a look. "Your Honor," Price said carefully, "the Department of Justice has a profound interest in the well-being of Mr. Thorne." Heston, still believing he was in a normal legal fight, scoffed. "Oh, I see. The consultant is a federal witness? Is that it? You're here to, what, vouch for his character? It won't work. His testimony is uncorroborated." Agent Cho, the younger, silent one, finally spoke. His voice was like ice. "His testimony, Mr. Heston, is not uncorroborated." "Oh, yeah?" Heston said. "Where's your proof?" Cho tapped his ear. "We have audio, video. We have every word of his encounter with Miller and Kincaid. We have every second of their time inside that warehouse. We have them accepting the duffel bag. We have them discussing the idiot on the corner who saw them." The blood drained from Heston's face. You were bugging my officers." "They are not your officers, Mr. Heston," Price corrected. "They are the primary subjects of a federal racketeering investigation, Operation Kingfisher, an investigation that has been running for 18 months. Sarah Jenkins's mind was racing. So Mr. Thorne, he was a witness? He was working with you?" Agent Price looked at Marcus. Marcus, who had been silent this entire time, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Not exactly, Miss Jenkins," Price said. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the man you know as Marcus Thorne, the risk consultant." He reached into the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was an official identification profile. He slid it across the desk. Judge Wallace picked it up. She read it. Her hands began to shake. She read it again. She looked up, her eyes wide with a dawning, profound horror. She wasn't looking at Heston or Sarah. She was looking at Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Director," she whispered. The words came out choked. Heston and Sarah looked at each other, confused. "What?" Heston said. "What director?" Judge Wallace held up the paper. The photo matched the man in the cheap suit. The name read, Marcus Julian Thorne, Director. Federal Bureau of Investigation silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Sarah Jenkins physically sat down in the nearest chair, her legs giving out. Heston made a small, squeaking sound, like a dying mouse. No, that's impossible. He's in a cheap suit. He's what, Mr. Heston? Marcus Thorne's voice cut through the air. The humility was gone. The consultant was gone. This was a new voice, the voice of ultimate authority, the voice of the man who ran a 50,000-person agency. "He's black," Marcus finished for him. "He's in a municipal court. I didn't mean," Heston stammered, backing away. "Your Honor," Marcus said, turning to the judge. "Operation Kingfisher is the largest sting of its kind. We are investigating a cancer in your city's police force. Officers Miller and Kincaid are not just corrupt. They are the linchpins of a cartel distribution network. I was on site to personally verify the last piece of evidence before the takedown. And they arrested you," Sarah whispered, her mind blown. "They arrested me," Marcus confirmed, "and I allowed it. I waived my one call. I refused to identify myself. I wanted to see the system from the inside. I wanted to see how far the rot went. And I must say," he added, looking at Heston, "it goes very, very far." Judge Wallace composed herself, her face now a mask of cold fury. "Agent Price, Mr. Director, what do you need from me?" "We need you to conclude this charade," Price said. "We are moving on the 17th precinct tonight. We are arresting Miller, Kincaid, and 15 other officers, including their captain. We cannot have this trial, contaminating the federal case." "I understand," Judge Wallace said. She stood up. "This is over." "What? What about me?" Heston whimpered. Marcus looked at him. "You, Mr. Heston, have a choice. You can be a cooperating witness for the Department of Justice in our investigation of the DA's office, or you can be a defendant." Heston looked like he was going to be sick. "We go back in that courtroom," Judge Wallace commanded. "And you, Mr. Heston, are going to move to dismiss. And you, Ms. Jenkins, you have my eternal apology." "No apology necessary, Your Honor," Sarah said, standing, her spine made of steel. "It's been educational." They re-entered the courtroom like actors returning for the final, grim scene of a play. The energy had shifted. The air crackled. Miller and Kincaid, who had been joking loudly in the gallery, shut their mouths the instant they saw the faces of the legal team. Heston was ashen, sweating through his suit. Sarah Jenkins looked stunned, but also energized. Judge Wallace returned to the bench, her face a thundercloud. Agents Price and Cho posted themselves at the courtroom doors, arms crossed. They were not bailiffs, they were sentinels. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Wallace said, "you may return to the defense table." Marcus calmly walked past Heston, past the bar, and sat next to Sarah. He did not look at Miller or Kincaid. "Be seated," the judge ordered. "Court is back in session. Mr. Heston, you were in the middle of your cross-examination." Heston stood, his legs visibly trembling. Your Honor." "Yes, Mr. Heston? After consultation, and in light of new information, the people move to dismiss all charges against the defendant." Miller and Kincaid shot to their feet simultaneously. "What?" Miller roared. "Heston, have you lost your mind? We had him." "This is a joke," Kincaid yelled at the judge. "You can't just let him go. He's guilty." "Silence!" Judge Wallace's gavel crashed down again and again. "Silence! Silence! Bailiff, restrain those two men." The lone, aging bailiff looked nervously between the two raging officers and the two stone-faced federal agents at the door. "Sit down, Frank. Sit down, Tom," Heston squeaked, terrified. "We're not sitting down." Miller jabbed a finger, first at Heston, then at the judge. "This is a fix. You're all corrupt. He threatened you, didn't he? That consultant threatened you." Marcus Thorne sat at the table, watching, his hands clasped. "Officer Miller, Officer Kincaid," Judge Wallace said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are in my courtroom. You will show respect, or I will have you thrown in a holding cell for a week." "You can't talk to us like that." Miller was completely unhinged, his career flashing before his eyes. He had lost. The nobody in the cheap suit had won. "We're the law." "You," Judge Wallace said, "are a disgrace. I have seen your performance in this court today. I have heard you, Officer Miller, perjure yourself on the stand. I heard you, Officer Kincaid, invent a story about a service weapon to cover your partner. And I was personally informed," she said, her eyes flashing at the bailiff, who suddenly looked very ill, "of your conduct in the hallway during recess." She leaned forward. "I am dismissing this case with extreme prejudice." "Mr. Thorne," she said, turning to him, "you are free to go, and you have my profound apologies for this failure of the system." Marcus stood. He nodded once to the judge. "Thank you for your time, Your Honor." He then turned to Sarah Jenkins. He extended his hand. "Ms. Jenkins, your performance today was admirable. You are a credit to your profession." Sarah, blushing, shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Marcus then buttoned his jacket and turned to leave. His path took him directly past the gallery row, where Miller and Kincaid were standing, pulsating with rage. Miller stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. "This ain't over. We see you on the street again. It'll be a different story." Marcus stopped. He was inches from Miller's face. The entire courtroom held its breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Officer Miller," Marcus said, his voice a quiet, surgical scalpel. "You have a house on 12th Street. You have a $40,000 boat you keep at the marina, King's Ransom. You bought it with cash. You have a safety deposit box at the First National, number 312. And you, Officer Kincaid, your son's tuition at Georgetown. It's being paid by an offshore shell company, Cerulean Imports." The color drained from both officers' faces. This was not a guess. This was information. "You're right, officer," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "This isn't over. It's just beginning. You had your chance to be the law. Now you get to face it." He stepped around the two men, who were frozen in place, and walked toward the exit. "He's threatening us!" Kincaid finally managed to yell, his voice cracking. "Did you hear that? He's threatening officers of the law." "Officers," Judge Wallace said. "Not for long. Officer Miller, Officer Kincaid, based on your belligerent conduct, your threats against a citizen, and your clear and repeated perjury on the stand, I find you both in summary contempt of court. You will be remanded to custody immediately." "You can't do that," Miller yelled. "Bailiff, arrest those men." The bailiff moved, but before he could, Agents Price and Cho glided forward from the doors. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor," Agent Price said. "The holding cell isn't secure enough." He looked at the two officers. "Frank Miller, Tom Kincaid," he said, pulling a set of cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and operating as agents of a foreign cartel." It was the karma. It was the moment. "You're making a mistake," Miller screamed, as Cho expertly spun him around and cuffed him. "This is entrapment," Kincaid shrieked, as Price did the same to him. "No," Agent Cho said, pulling Kincaid's cuffs tight. "This is a reckoning." As they were being dragged, kicking and screaming, from the courtroom, Miller's eyes fell on Marcus Thorne, who had stopped by the door to watch. You did this," Miller screamed. "Who are you?" Marcus Thorne looked at the man who had mocked him, shoved him, and called him boy. He adjusted the sleeve of his cheap suit. "I'm just a concerned citizen," he said, and he walked out the door. The fallout was biblical. Operation Kingfisher, with the arrests of Miller and Kincaid, was triggered. By nightfall, 17 officers of the 17th Precinct, including a captain and 2 lieutenants, were in federal custody. The warehouse on 4th and Elm was raided, revealing millions in cash and narcotics. The entire command structure of the city's police force was dissolved. Ada Heston, as promised, became the star witness for the Department of Justice, trading his testimony about the systemic corruption in the DA's office for a plea deal that would see him disbarred, but out of prison. Judge Cynthia Wallace was lauded for her handling of the situation. Her career, which had been stalling, was suddenly on a fast track to the federal bench. Frank Miller and Tom Kincaid, facing a mountain of evidence that included audio, video, and the full weight of the U.S. government, never saw trial. They both pleaded guilty. Miller received 30 years in a federal supermax prison. Kincaid, for his meager cooperation, received 25. They were stripped of their pensions, their homes were seized, and their families were left with nothing but shame. The king's ransom was sold at a government auction. The hard karma had hit, not with a sudden bolt of lightning, but with the slow, crushing, inevitable weight of a glacier. 1 week later, in Washington, D.C., Sarah Jenkins stood nervously in the lobby of the J. Edgar Hoover Building. The lobby was vast, a cathedral of federal power. She had been flown in, first class, and put up in a luxury hotel. "Miss Jenkins," she turned. Agent Cho was there, now in a different, equally impeccable suit. "The director will see you now." She was escorted to the top floor, through security checkpoints that made her old courthouse look like a playground. She was led into a sprawling, immaculate office with a vast window overlooking the Capitol. Behind a desk of polished mahogany sat Marcus Thorne. He was not wearing the cheap suit. He was wearing a bespoke, navy blue suit that probably cost more than her car. His tie was silk. His shoes shined. He was, in every sense, the most powerful man she had ever seen. He stood as she entered. "Sarah, please come in." "Mr. Director," she said, her voice small. I don't know what to." "You," he said, "are an exceptional lawyer. You stood your ground. You defended your client, even when you had no idea who he was. You fought against power, and you did it with integrity. That," he said, "is rarer than you can imagine." I was just doing my job, sir." "You were," he agreed. "Which is why I've brought you here. I'm dissolving the risk assessment firm," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "But the Department of Justice is starting a new civil rights task force focused on police reform. It's going to be ugly, and it's going to be a fight. I need a bulldog. I need someone who isn't afraid of officers like Miller, or DAs like Heston, or judges who've given up." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "I need you, Sarah. The job is yours if you want it." Sarah looked at the man who had been her client, the man in the cheap suit. She thought of the mockery, the arrogance of Miller and Kincaid, and the moment they realized who they had truly crossed. It was justice. It was karma. And now she was being offered a seat at the table. "Sir," Sarah Jenkins said, sitting down and taking the offered file, "what's our first case?" "They say that pride comes before the fall. For Officers Miller and Kincaid, pride wasn't just a feeling, it was a weapon. They used it to mock, to intimidate, and to abuse. But on that one fateful day, they aimed their weapon at a man who was not a nobody. He was a mountain. Their arrogance, their racism, and their own corruption blinded them to the truth. And in the end, the system they thought they controlled, the system they had poisoned, was the very one that crushed them. It's a powerful reminder that you never, ever know who you are talking to. The person you dismiss today might just be the one holding your entire world in their hands tomorrow. Thank you for watching. We hope this story of hard karma served cold was a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, is always coming. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and make sure to subscribe for more real-life drama.